There is some problem, yeah. So formally, I welcome Professor Indrajit Roy at York University. He's going to talk about his latest sensational book, Politics of the Poor, which is going to define the way we look at state-society relationship with the focus on poverty and poor. It's very timely, relevant, and incredibly important book to all of us. I would request Saradi Banerjee, the convener of Bukadda, and I thank Professor Ritambra Hamber, our formidable anthropologist and also team. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we are very excited and honored to welcome Indrajit today. So just to give a basic introduction, I won't. So Indrajit finished his PhD in development studies from the University of Oxford. But much before that, I think he's also a product of TIS, just like all of us. And then he worked extensively in the development sector for 7 years before he joined the University of Oxford. And after obtaining his PhD in development studies, he has held the European Social Research Council Future Research Leader Fellowship at the Oxford Department of International Development, as well as a Junior Research Fellowship at Wolfson College in the University of Oxford. Dr. Roy's research areas are broadly in three, three big areas that he is currently researching on. Our first is his European Social Research Council funded project on the future of citizenship, which looks at the idea of citizenship through comparative ethnographies in the global north as well as the global south. Secondly, he looks at the politics of the poor people and their subjectivities to ethnographic and historical institutional methods. And this book is probably the product of that research agenda that he's pursuing. And thirdly, he looks at the broader question of development in the global south and so-called the phenomenon of rising powers in the global south, especially with respect to the rise of China and the political dynamics of the economic and political rise of China. So before that, secondly, I would also like to welcome Dr. Roy for his book. And so the presentation for today is as follows, that Dr. Roy will sort of do a presentation for 15 to 20 minutes, followed by a discussion with Professor Ashwini Kumar. So he will kind of comment, and then Professor Ritambra Hamber will comment, and that will sort of kickstart the discussion process. So thank you, Dr. Roy. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for that generous introduction, Ashwini. Thank you, Shauradeep, for this introduction. As I feared, I am not able to share my PowerPoint on the Zoom.
No issues.
So I've sent it to you, actually, Shauradeep. Okay. And Ashwini, I don't know if you've received it. Try. And if you wanted to share it. If we can't, that's no problem at all. I'm quite happy to talk, but maybe we can give it a minute or so if you can have a look. I'm doing this first time, I should say, online. Okay. I apologize for any techie goof up in advance, but I'm sure you will all understand.
No, I guess, Indrajit, just coming in here, what we will do that we will circulate your presentation with your consent, amongst us. And it's very important for research scholars to look at your methodology, the advances you have made. And then, it's a beautiful that, we are not able to share here because this gives us more intimate setting.
I can do that.
More intimate setting to talk about it.
Shauradeep should be able to do it. He'll just share screen and then it'll get done.
Can you do that?
So what Dr. Roy could do is just prompt Shauradeep every time he wants his PPT. I mean, he wants him to change the PPT, the slide.
Yeah. So I figured what I would do is, rather than providing a chapter by chapter summary of the book, I could use this opportunity to reflect on the motivations, the research questions that animate the book, and a slice of the argument that I make in the book. I also hope to illustrate the ways in which the material in the book, although it's drawing on ethnographic work in 4 Eastern Indian villages, it actually tells a global story of democracy and serves a note of caution to both unbridled optimists who celebrate democracy's march, as well as despairing pessimists who bewail its impending death.
First open the PPT.
Okay.
So,
Can you see?
Yeah. So, Sharadeep, are you able to open the PPT and share it with everyone?
Yeah. So, can you see my screen right now?
I can see your screen. That's right.
You first need to open the PPT. You first
Oh.
open that PPT.
Okay.
Open that PPT and then just go, just present it.
Mm-hmm.
Stop screen share. You first open it on a computer and then go to screen share again.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about this.
No, I'm sorry. I should have checked beforehand. But like I said, you were my sort of the first time guinea pigs almost. So now I'll know. Thank you.
Is it fine?
Yeah. Now, Sharadeep, what you do is click on that full screen mode, no? Below the button, below the cornermost. Yeah, that's done.
Yeah. And yeah, I had very nicely put in animations, which will probably make your life more difficult, Sharadeep. So just
no issues.
You know, just go on clicking, I guess. So yeah, if you click on, again, could you click again? Yes, great, thank you. Now, could you move to the next slide? Thanks. So, and then just, yes, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
So the world today is richer than it has been in any time in recorded history. 1% of its richest people own over half its wealth, while 80% of the global population shares less than 5% of this wealth. Now, such inequalities and the poverty associated with these inequalities sit very awkwardly with the fact that more people inhabit democracies today than ever before. As a matter of fact, over 1.6 billion people estimated to be living in poverty, close to 1 billion inhabit democracies, where they elect their governments and are promised a share in political participation. If you could just continue. Now, that poverty and inequality cohabit with democracy provides the starting point for the themes that I explore in this monograph. What does living in a democracy mean for the world's billion-plus poor, people who confront simultaneously deprivations and disparities? So this central question motivates the book. One response to this question has been provided by what you might call the democracy enthusiasts. They suggest that poor people's politics is a politics of assimilation into the universal promise of democracy. So in this view, the poor absorb the ideas and identities associated with democracy, such as citizenship, rights, development, and modernity. In this view, the poor consent to democracy. And this view derives inspiration, as you can imagine, from the end of history narratives that became popular after the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR. Another response to this question comes from those you might call the democracy cynics. They say that the politics of the poor is a politics of difference. In this view, poor people are too weighed down by their particularistic concerns of life and livelihood to care about such esoteric matters as democracy. Their everyday vulnerabilities compel them to take recourse to what are called clientelistic politics, moral vocabularies, preservations of their lifestyle, and the comfort of their traditions. In this view, poor people are in conflict with democracy. And much of the recent literature on the democratic recession, the democratic backsliding, suggests that poor people are responsible for populist politics and other such problems. And it's of this genre that we can say. Now, these literatures resonate with debates in India. During the 1990s, we had scholars arguing that India was in the throes of a democratic upsurge and poor people were voting more than the rich. Now, while that may well have been the case during the 90s, poor people's electoral enthusiasm appears to have waned since, and any sort of survey of the National Election Survey, etc., will sort of say that. Now, from this to argue, as is sometimes done, that poor people are disinterested in politics or are easily swayed by right-wing populists, however, I think is swinging to the other extreme and being equally unproductive. So the book was written against the false binaries of universalism and particularism to present a more nuanced and comprehensive account of the ways in which poor people did politics in democracies. Now, let's just to be clear by what I mean by politics. I mean because so many, any textbook, offers you so many definitions of politics. What I mean is the variety of ways in which people engage with institutions and actors who exert power to shape their lives. For this reason, the book's subtitle focuses on negotiation to describe the processes through which poor people comply with, but also at the same time contest such uses of power. And these negotiations refer to provisional transactions. So they are not sort of fixed, but they're very provisional, they're very tentative. Provisional transactions between transient collectives of people in poverty. So these are transient collectives, not fixed, organized, registered bodies, but transient collectives of people in poverty with politicians, bureaucrats, employers, elites, and often with one another. So we're not talking about class struggle, so to speak, but we're talking about much more everyday sorts of negotiations. And the book's empirical argument is that such heterogeneous negotiations are a crucial repertoire for poor people's politics. These negotiations combine consent with conflict. They're not necessarily conducted within formal or official institutions, nor are they convened by organizations or political parties of the poor on the basis of shared class or ethnic identities. They outlast electoral cycles, indicating that poor people do not quietly accept the authority of their elected representatives. They neither assimilate into democracy, as the democracy optimists would have us believe, nor is there a politics of difference vis-a-vis democracy, as the democracy cynics would have us believe. Rather, what I've tried to do in the book is to suggest that poor people's politics approximates what is being called an agonistic approach to democracy. And in making this argument, I found Chantal Mouffe's formulation of agonistic politics to be quite useful. So Mouffe develops her theory in critical conversation vis-a-vis both liberals, such as John Rawls, as well as communitarians such as Michael Sandel, to think about the ideas and practices of democracy beyond a liberal telos, beyond a liberal endpoint, or beyond a liberal standard. Her account reminds us that democracy is not liberalism. The conceptual histories of democracy and liberalism have been in tension with one another, and there is in fact no necessary relation between the two. Liberalism, as we know, is about enforcing the rule of law, about defending human rights and protecting individual liberty. Democracy is about recognizing equality, bridging the gap between the governed and the governing, and ensuring popular sovereignty. The two traditions have sometimes overlapped, but we have to appreciate that liberal democracy is only one of several types of democracy. So that's the insight I've drawn from Mouffe. And the agonistic perspective helps me to think about democracy beyond standard liberal models. That is generally quite common. The ethnographic research on which the book draws was conducted in 4 villages in the eastern Indian states of Bihar and West Bengal. In Bihar, I selected 2 adjacent villages in the northern Bihar district of Araria. In West Bengal, I looked at 2 adjacent villages in Malda district, which is in central West Bengal. The motivation of selecting these districts was straightforward. It was based on the state level district indicators, which suggested poverty and, which ranked districts according to human development indices. Malda came at the bottom of the West Bengal list, or near the bottom of the West Bengal list. At that point, Bihar didn't have a list of human development, list of districts. But people I spoke to in Patna, they suggested that, the northeast corner was a good place to go to. And, you could select between Araria, Purnia, Kishanganj. I selected Araria because it was a newly carved district where the state's presence, I imagined, wouldn't be extremely pervasive. But I do think the findings from this research, even though they are drawn on ethnographic work from these 4 villages in Eastern India, I do think the findings resonate with experiences of other democracies. And I want to illustrate this with a specific example from the book. If you could move to the next slide, Shauradeep, which is from chapter 4, where I describe the diverse ways in which poor people negotiate with politicians, bureaucrats, and others to obtain below poverty line cards, BPL cards, which I'm sure this audience will know, entitle their holders to subsidize food and housing, as well as a variety of social assistance, such as maternity benefits, old age pensions, and the like. The cards are targeted through means tests, which only aggravates competition among people who have to prove themselves to be adequately poor in order to be eligible. And poor people often supplicate before their politicians, political mediators, and other elites to request that they be considered eligible, to waive off the stringent means tests because so much is at stake. This chapter is titled The Politics of Supplications, to request, to appeal, to plead before someone superior. Now, empirically, of course, people use the language of, agraha, nivedan, they are making requests, they are, appealing to the goodness of politicians and local elites. But how do we analyze these supplications? And Shauradeep, if you could just sort of click. One option is to view these supplications as examples of clientelistic practices. Clientelism, as this audience will know, has been defined by the sociologist Johnny Fox as a relationship based on political subordination in exchange for material rewards. So a politician asks the people to vote for him or her, and in exchange, they will provide material reward. So the autonomy of the voter is restricted. Now, such a description is tempting, but it may not accurately describe what's going on. Certainly, poor people plead, appeal, and request their elected representatives and other politicians. But I thought there was little evidence to suggest that the idioms of care and protection that they invoked made poor people politically subordinate in any way. In many cases, people warned their elected representatives not to take their electoral support for granted. In other cases, poor people made their requests to their elected representatives, even when it was well known that they had not voted for that politician. And while it is true that the politician in question often refused to help, the fact remains that the supplicants did not compromise their political autonomy at any point. They voted exactly the way they voted and they wanted to. And even when a different politician from the one they had voted came to power, they still went and requested them for help. So referring to poor people's politics as clientelistic may be inaccurate. And we can discuss this in the Q&A if you like. An alternative approach might be to suggest that poor people's supplications signal a transition to citizenship because it's not clientelistic, it's citizenship. And I specify in this chapter the contractual underpinnings of people's pleas, which were almost always accompanied by narratives such as, we voted for you, now you must provide us the cards. Or you got elected because poor people like us supported you, now you must help us. Spontaneous delegations of people sought to meet the president of their local government, mukhyas in Bihar, pradhans in West Bengal, directly without going through mediators, brokers, and fixers. Now, that said, analyzing these supplications as a politics of citizenship, I think would also be inappropriate because, well, people supplicate. Although they indicate an awareness that BPL cards are meant for the poor, they avoid juridical vocabularies of law, rights, entitlements, and so on. Rather, they prefer to ignite the sympathy of their politicians by describing themselves as deprived people in need of help. A third alternative, bypassing the dichotomies inherent in the above approaches, might be to subscribe to Partha Chatterjee's now famous formulation that people in poverty indulge in a politics of political society. And Chatterjee formulates the concept of political society through his fascinating discussion of squatter communities in Kolkata who, faced with the prospect of being evicted from their slums that are being declared illegal by the municipal government, plead with the authorities to be exempted from the law. In the cases presented in this book, in The Politics of the Poor, one could argue that by invoking moral idioms of care, poor people plead with their politicians to suspend the means tests and request them to be exempt from cutoffs. They present themselves as a moral community of poor people, Amra Gorib Manush or Hum Garib Log Hain, who deserve the care and concern of the state. Undoubtedly, such practices bolster the arbitrary authority of the state and are not founded on the rule of law, but such arbitrariness, we are told, is to be preferred because it helps poor people protect their meager possessions. Now, I have no problem at all with the empirically informed perspective that poor people are compelled to supplicate, to plead and request that they be exempt from certain laws and rules that hurt their interests, and to also construct themselves as a moral community of poor people. But from this empirical point to make the theoretical claim, which I think Chatterjee does, that poor people's politics is a politics of differentiated membership in the political community, is to ignore the egalitarian expectations that accompany poor people's supplications. Even the most restrained supplicants of the BPL cards resented the ways in which they had been reduced to being beggars. And you can see even in the quote that I've put up here, with which the chapter starts, the person says that they pleaded with the mukhya today so that their children did not have to plead before anyone tomorrow. So there is an egalitarian expectation that accompanies a lot of these supplications. Endorsing a differentiated notion of membership in the political community, as Chatterjee does in Lineages of Political Society, ignores such egalitarian expectations that poor people have all the time. Against these three scholarly approaches, anchored in the concepts of clientelism, citizenship, and political society, I make the case in this chapter and throughout the book to think of poor people's supplications as agonistic negotiations. Why agonistic, you will ask? Because across the four villages, and I suspect elsewhere, poor people's supplications draw on an inchoate antagonism against members of the wealthy and propertied classes. They routinely invoke metaphors of injustice, anyay, and oppression, attachar in Bangla, atyachar in Hindi. As far as they can tell, they are poor because they are exploited by farmers, industrialists, contractors, middlemen, politicians, bureaucrats, policemen, and sometimes even by other people in poverty. So the languages of shoshan is something that you come across pretty often in rural Bihar and Bengal. For instance, one of my Shautal interlocutors, a Shautal woman in West Bengal, said, "Jar mathay joto tel, she aru beshi tel paye," which is a Bangla phrase, which when you translate into English would be those who have more, get more. And of course, she's referring to hair oil. So those people who have more hair oil, get more hair oil. But the point is that she's trying to say that those who have more already are able to accumulate more. In Bihar, a Kunjra Muslim man said, "Sarkar हमसे चावल लेकर अमीरों को बिरयानी खिलाती है और हमें चपाती भी नहीं खाने देती है," which is to say that the government takes our rice to make biryani for the rich, but they will not let us even eat a simple chapati. The refrain was, in this particular case, that the government's policy of targeting social assistance only benefited enterprising people who could easily corner these resources. Where poor people who believed that they were wrongly excluded from BPL lists express discontent, they direct their anger at the machinations of the elected representatives or other political mediators, or they blame the manipulation of their wealthier neighbors who procure the BPL cards by edging out those who were more deserving than others. They very rarely direct their discontent against other households of similar socio-economic backgrounds who do receive BPL cards. So if your neighbor who's in a similar situation has received a BPL card, I found very little evidence that they were blaming the neighbors. They were blaming somebody else. They hardly acquiesce in their own subordination or consent to being dominated. Their frequent use of vocabularies of anyay and atyachar suggests that they do not harbor any illusions that they are somehow responsible for their own poverty. The narratives of kismat, of luck that comes up, that's often sort of bandied about, or karma for that matter, that is often held responsible for people's poverty. Certainly the poor themselves didn't seem to believe in it. Nevertheless, the poor do not at the same time express any thoughts about a revolutionary overthrow of the existing order or the annihilation of propertied groups. Many among them labor in the fields and farms of wealthier peasants and farmers. They face the repression of wages. They face the practice of social discrimination. They see the nurturing of social hierarchy. Others are in debt of moneylenders or farmers, a situation about which they constantly worry. But a recognition of these oppressions does not, however, lead them to imagine the destruction of the oppressive structures to which they are subjected. And I'm almost done. So if I have a few more minutes, I'll wind up now. Rather, the impoverished men and women whose practices have been examined in this book weave collaboration and contention with their negotiations. They realize that the targeting policy is disastrous and refuse to subject quietly to its conditions. However, they do not reject it altogether. They plead, appeal, request, but they also cajole, threaten, ghirao, surround their politicians and threaten them. Their supplications combine entreaties of care with the heckling of politicians, although as I show in other chapters of the book, these combinations vary. And we can talk a little more about chapter 5, which I'm not presenting now, but we can talk about if you like, where I talk about poor people's engagements with the public works program, the Manrega. And I show that they demand work under the provisions of the Act. Instead of the language of appeals, pleas, and requests, signals in terms such as agraha and nibedan, which we saw in chapter 4, we hear more vocabularies of claims. West Bengal's applicants for Narega told their politicians they wanted work, not charity. Kaat chai, daan noy. Or in Bihar, it was common to hear applicants say they weren't begging, but asking for work. Majduri ki maang kar rahe hain, bheek nahi maang rahe hain. But even so, they refrained from appropriating the language of rights. They didn't use the word of adhikar or hak. They rather invoked their collective identities as laboring poor, who should be compensated for their labor or be given work to do, or at the very least helped because they were poor. So in conclusion, I want to say that such negotiations shape the everyday lives of the people you will meet in the book. The agricultural laborers, the peasants and farmers, construction workers, hawkers and vendors, rickshaw pullers, plumbers, masons, and domestic helps, for whom democracy offers unprecedented opportunities to advance their social claims, but does not eliminate social and economic inequalities in which they are embedded. Like millions of impoverished inhabitants of other democracies, these men and women combine guarded consent with inchoate conflict as they negotiate democracy. They are Democrats without necessarily subscribing to liberal values that sanctify individualism, private property, and the rule of law. Their supplications, demands, disputations, and imaginations reveal the very nuances of their negotiations with the practices of democracy. And the politics of the poor demonstrates the intricate ways in which democracies could be rejuvenated, but also threatened by agonistic negotiations. And it's time that analysts of democracy did so as well. That's the plea I end with in the book. So I'll stop here, and maybe if there are questions or thoughts or comments or whatever way you would like to proceed, that's fine. I'll hand back to Shauradeep. Thank you so much for navigating the PowerPoint as seamlessly as you did. Thanks. I'm grateful.
Yeah, thanks, Indrajit, for the brilliant presentation. I would request our Dean, Professor Ithambra Hebbar, to make a few comments.
You caught me there. I thought I was going to come after Ashwini.
No. I mean, like,
well, because
this was Ashwini's idea.
It's a conversation in the thing. So it's a adda. So there is no hierarchy, no, sequential, anyone anytime can come in, anyone. So it's not like, you, me, and versus others. It's like,
nothing like that at all.
A book discussion, it becomes really, I mean, like, very jarring experience.
I completely understand.
I look at it, book as a storytelling. I loved your story. I enjoyed your story, and on the ground for several years now. So multiple stories from all over the country. When collector in one district, Ridhamra, wanted to know me when I was inspecting Narega work. That said, what do you like? We are organizing dinner. Rather than thinking about livelihoods for poor, he was thinking more about my dinner. What do you like to have? I said that I'm kind of wanderer. I'm kind of monk, and I was trying to avoid the question and his quiz. And then I said that I love milk. I love milk. I'm a milk baby. So. And he got so disappointed, because, all kinds of things you can imagine when you are looking after government jobs, supervision, etc. And I asked Professor Haber, she has been in Jharkhand, she has done, primary work in Jharkhand, and very engaged work, stayed in the field. I'm sure that our research scholars are learning a lot from your work. The whole, idea, Indrajit, I would like to hear from you, the stories about your field engagement. I guess Ridhamra can come in here too. I mean, like, how did you put it?
Yes, since you have been asked to talk,
tell some stories, yeah.
I will just sort of open up the discussion. I'll probably come back with some more questions later. One is to really get a sense of how did you go about doing your field work in these four villages? Because as an anthropologist, my personal experience is that even doing one village is quite a task. Becomes difficult when you're doing an ethnography. So I was wondering how you sort of structured your research as far as these four sort of villages are concerned. So I'm sure it was not a village study. So so you were comparing on certain terms. So it'll be nice to know more on that. The second question I have is, again, I come from an anthropological lens, so forgive me for that. I'm not taking the political scientist route of questioning. But I was thinking that since there is this whole sort of strong sense of a moral community that you say exists among the poor, especially when it comes to the state. So I wonder how they actually perceive the state, because in the villages that you've selected, one of the things that immediately sort of occurs to me is that these are somewhere the local state, mirrors the very deep entrenched inequality in society. So making it very difficult to really distinguish between the hierarchies within society, the oppressive structures within society, and that within the state. So when you say that there is a sense of a model community of the poor vis-a-vis the state, so I would be interested to know, is it a more porous understanding of a state, or, I mean, how are we to understand the notion of the state as it emerges in their perception? So these, I'll leave you with these two, and then I'll come back again. But first, I would like to really hear about your fieldwork, because doing four is quite a commendable sort of task and very difficult field areas, I must say.
Thank you. No, I should say that they were very, very challenging in terms of just sort of getting to terms with doing four. but one gets an entry point, then it sort of, just becomes smooth. And in some ways, the fieldwork continues till date, because there have been several sort of follow-on projects which have allowed me and now a team of collaborators to work with some of these individuals and people that I had first met 10 years ago. I have to say that when I started out, I had grand notions that I would, make it a very sort of strictly comparable village study, and I'd look at indicators, which is where I sort of, tried to map out the indicators. And then I sort of realized that that's not quite how things would happen. I had the choice to go through organizations, activist organizations locally. But the worry, of course, is that you get too embedded with the activist organizations per se. My strategy was to go through organizations nonetheless, but once I was in the village, I sort of dissociated myself from the organization. And I told the organization, both the organizations, that I would like to work in an area where you have a presence and an area where you don't have a presence. So of course, where they didn't have a presence, it was very easy, fairly easy to, just be this chap who's coming into research. And I framed my work in terms of trying to understand how society has changed. And that I figured was it was very comforting to my interlocutors, especially the elites, because they they had been a little worried about this new chap coming around and snooping around. And, I was asking questions about NREGA and government government schemes. But the moment I said, well, no, I'm just interested in looking at, how life has changed, how society has changed, they were very comfortable with that. Of course, that did mean a lot of others were a little exasperated, because they said, what do you mean how life has changed? And people, contrary to what we believe, it's not that, people in rural areas don't understand research. They do understand what research is. They do expect you to have a very specific set of questions. And they were frustrated that I wasn't asking those specific sets of questions, which I suppose the NGOs that I had sort of, wrote the back of used to ask. But my response always was, no, I really want to understand what has changed. What's the same? In what ways has your lives changed? The two villages in each of the states were contiguous. So they were in a sense, they were on either side of the road. Okay. So going from one to another, the two villages in each state, they were contiguous. So going from one village to another within a state wasn't necessarily a task. It was, you could sort of easily walk between two villages and meet with people in a day. And I spent several months in each. So it was, after a few weeks, I was well known in both villages of the two states. So of course, these were 4 gram panchayats, but in each state, they were very contiguous. And going from one village, one district to another, remember this is Araria and Malda, where there was the train route is, I think it takes about 4 hours. There's one train, I think, probably now it's daily, but then it was a 3-day, so it was 3 days a week. But you could still sort of be from Araria to Malda in 4 to 6 hours. And if you went via Katihar, it was sort of, if you change at Katihar, it was even easier. So in that sense, these were strategically selected to be, to not make my life more difficult than it would be already, if I may say. But it was, of course, as you can imagine, making those initial rappos was difficult. I had some very interesting encounters with the local state, since you mentioned that. The Mukhia's office in one of the Bihar panchayats was convinced that I had been sent from Delhi And at one point in the evening, I went to ask for records of the, the Enrega, and just to understand, who was getting benefits and who was getting work and who wasn't. Of course, they didn't have the records in the panchayat office. It was in the Mukhia's house. So they actually tried to bribe me. And they put some money into my hand, and I said, no, don't say that, and don't do this. And of course, later they all said, no, we were testing you. We were trying to see what you were. And, I told Mukhya ji that he will never take money. But obviously there was a lot going on where people were constantly trying to identify and understand who exactly this person was, who had come from Delhi, who said that they were coming from Delhi and they were, researching local life. And I guess I was lucky in obviously not having taken the bribe, because then I would have easily been slotted on one side or the other. But also that people did have a basic sort of trust. I think my being a Kayast Hindu from Delhi did make me sort of more acceptable to the elites in Bihar and in, of course, West Bengal. One of the two villages in West Bengal was a Muslim majority village, but they were Sheikh Muslims who were self-consciously high caste Muslims. So in a sense, they, the moment they knew I was a Kayasto from Delhi, they were very welcoming, and they were trying to show how they themselves had been converts from, they were Brahmins 500 years ago. And then Ma Kali apparently came to the village head and said, you must embrace Islam. And that was a very interesting story of Ma Kali telling people to embrace Islam. But the point is that, they were trying to, the elites were trying to build bridges. And I had to be careful not to be seen too close to the elites, because of course, when you're talking to the poor, most of people of impoverished communities would be Dalits. And
one of the reasons why I also asked you this question was because I was quite intrigued by one statement you made in the middle of your presentation about how, when they were actually talking about, the fact that the government is not really reaching out to them in terms of benefits, whatever, but they would never really comment on their poor neighbors rather, who were managing to get the benefits from the state, right? So the fact that they would keep quiet and not talk about it, and that's one of the ways in which you also build the idea of model community, that despite, irrespective of the fact that some do get it and some don't, there is a notion of being a model community. But I was wondering that when there is a state which is porous, the local state which is that porous, among the poor, that's my own observation. I might be completely off the mark when it comes to your field, but my own sense was that there is a implicit hidden sense of distrust even of your neighbors. So there are ways in which you think that your neighbors might have got their way through while you haven't. And therefore it becomes, you become far more conscious in the way that you talk about people around you, while you might posit to an outsider that you're a model community. And there is always this expectation that the outsider coming to do research on you might be able to in the end benefit you in some way. So there is a instrumental sort of relationship nowadays, at least when you do ethnography, that people associate even with researchers.
Yeah.
Because there is an acute sense that these are researchers, all right, but they do represent the elite with whom we try to bargain. Somewhere they are closer to them than us. And so the idea of an innocent research doesn't exist anymore. So somewhere that experience of the fact that you said that they didn't really talk negatively about their neighbors does not, should not, I mean, for me, it never really translated into trust. It also translated into, into this sort of politics of the everyday, where people actually are very aware of everyday politics and the way in which even their neighbors have different equations with the state. And there are various ways in which people are negotiating with the state, while you might not be able to have been able to do so. But electorally or otherwise, they might present themselves as a moral community. And one of the reasons why a revolutionary change becomes difficult, the idea of, that sort of a drastic overthrow of the system becomes so difficult to now imagine.
Yeah,
so I wonder whether you felt the same at all.
I agree. I mean, it may well have been that they were trying to sort of project a certain way of being. It may also have been that they, I was just such a fly on the wall, and I was flitting in and out of people's, meeting people all the time, and, chatting with person X, and with, their neighbors and their sort of, people around them. Perhaps people may well have feared that I would pass on, how they perceived about neighbors to others, and therefore they didn't. It may well be the case. I cannot rule that out at all. This is not to say that there weren't disputes between neighbors. And in Bihar particularly, I mean, if there's a litigious state in India, I think it's Bihar, but maybe anywhere else, everyone seems to have had disputes with their neighbors over property lines, where the boundary of the house is, etc. And where the people I lived with, they had a dispute with their neighbors. But of course, the people I lived with were Yadavs and their neighbors were Rajputs. And it was a mixed caste, multi-class locality where the Rajput neighbor was obviously better off, and they had a concrete mansion, whereas these guys had a sort of mud hut which they were upgrading. So the class differential is very obvious. Even though they were neighbors, they were easily of different classes. But you're right. The one reason that people may have chosen to not snitch on their neighbors to me may have been because of the ease with which I was seen to be, accessing other individuals and, going into their homes or being invited.
Indrajit, if you allow me, Indrajit, can I come in here? Can I come in here? Can I come in here? See, there is, all of us, I mean, like trained in a different way, disciplinary. But despite that, we have a consensus, when we hit the field. I mean, Paul Bros, if you remember Paul Bros' early writings, much before anybody who went to Bihar, Paul Bros was there, 65, 66, 67, documenting Bihar famine and commenting on that, even on, Maghi language, so on and so forth. But the reason that I'm looking at, and I want to know from you, that, and also my anthropologist colleague here, that when we hit the trail as an ethnographer, but when I look at my discipline, many of us, did work, but we never hit the field as ethnographer, because the moment you say that, I'm an ethnography, and that's where I learned from Paul Bros, and Paul Bros also over time, I'm sharing this note with my students around, that over time you become, like, it's like a good wine. So over time you become a really great researcher, So it was not the same Paul Bros who said that I'm going to do hit and run, research. By the time he comes to Aligarh, and then he, works out his classic work, Sept of an Idol, which is like the most critical literature to anyone researching riots, and especially anthropologists, ethnographers, and critical scientists. So what I'm trying to say that, the whole notion that I'm ethnographer and the whole notion that I'm political scientist somehow implicitly, subconsciously affects us when we do the field work. And there are many different ways, as a researcher over time, we come to talk to ourselves and try to resolve that issue, because that somehow gets reflected. For instance, people who go to Bihar, and if you look at, Bihar is most talked about, but is the most under-researched, If you look at, new crop of political scientists in the US, Prerna Singh, she went to Bihar, but they spent little time. People go to Bihar, but spend very little time. There are very few, like Arvind Das, homegrown Bihari, and who could
Professor Ashwini
understand
Kumar.
Bihar. Yeah, or no, it's not. Please. So what I'm trying to say that, I hear, it's not a critique of sociology as a discipline, but if you look at, sociology, the body of works, major sociologists, Indrajit, and you are right, they just ignored Bihar. And Bihar was already, I mean, in the 60s, late 60s, I don't know any paper talking about flaming fields in Bihar. Nothing. I mean, like senas after senas, and when I started chasing them, I realized that, the key term that Professor Rajni Kothari, once again, my guru, mentor, and the great political scientist, what Rajni trained us in one thing. Rajni was not a fieldwork oriented guy, he was more archival, archival ethnographer, if I can say. But he taught us politicization. So it's not a query, not a question. I'm just sharing, some ideas with all of us. That I guess, politics of politicization or the degree of politicization in Bihar is quite important, and this is where, the Chicago school's ideas of, urban sociology, which looked at every space. I have lived in Chicago for a while, neighborhood sociology. But when you go Bihar, there is already Nishant is in, I can see him here, talking and chatting. And you have seen that even a village, in a big village, there are many villages in Bihar. There are tolas, there are mohallas, and they are not on talking terms, And if you look at, I'm talking about in the midst of a major carnage, where people are killing each other, burning them, slaughtering them. And there you reach there as an anthropologist. There you reach as a political scientist. How do you respond to that? How do you, analyze field, I mean, that's something, this is a critique of my own discipline too, including sociology and anthropology. Because, now today people are rushing to Bihar because Bihar has become a policy paradise. NRGA, NRLM, ladkiyan cycle chala rahi hai, everything is happening. But look at, how Bihar has been understudied, neglected, overlooked by, great sociologists, political scientists. I mean, that's why. I don't know. Even in Akhil Gupta book, the great anthropologist, how many references you find about Bihar? On the other hand, if you look at,
the recent book by Anand Chakravarti is all on Bihar.
Anand
Chakravarti. There are people who are writing on Bihar, yeah, but
very few. I guess, I've given a whole list of books, that have been. It's not about. I'm not telling that Anand the Young didn't go there. As a historian, he did pioneering work. I'm trying to critique the discipline that I practice. It's an internal criticism is very important for us. Otherwise, the next generation researcher would not get there, where they want to be. It's very important to go back and look at why M.N. Srinivas avoided Bihar. When MN is writing his magnum opus, he has nothing to say about Bihar. Why? I mean, at the same time, when you are looking at land reforms, failure of land reforms, you can see caste massacres, and on the other hand, and you can see the, what is called politics of democracy in Bihar. That is where Indrajit book is so vital and relevant to us. The whole politics of democracy that plays out in his book is so different than politics of democracy in Kerala, politics of democracy in Tamil Nadu. Very different.
What happens is, I think what happens is when people from political science write about Bihar, they write about politics in Bihar or the state in Bihar. But when sociologists write about it, mostly they'll talk about caste and politics and things like that. So it seems as if, but you're actually talking about the same thing quite often. I mean, there is an intersection between the issues raised by sociologists, anthropologists, as with political scientists.
And political scientists.
And so it becomes, I mean, so it's basically how you look at that research. So for me, that is not really the concern, but my concern, what really comes out from your study, which I found it intriguing, is this. I still beg to differ from you on that notion of a moral community. I feel that when this, I think many of the societies where you find people are not able to get any resources from the state, it is as much a reflection of society and the fact that there is a lack of a community, that there's tremendous sense of mistrust between people in the community, which actually disallows them from maximizing.
Ritamra, may I come in here? This is where I want to come in, Ritamra. What is this moral community? I mean,
no,
like,
I didn't say it.
Yeah.
I'm quoting Indrajit only.
I have one Indrajit, one thing that Indrajit, that has I'm not going to critique. I'm not going to critique. What I'm trying to say that long back Ashish that wrote a piece, wonderful piece, and it was the Times of India op-ed, those days when Times of India was not, was a different newspaper, and what the essay was titled, "Imaginary Village." This is Ashish Das classic piece, and where Ashish, talking about something like Ronald Linden later on talked about reimagining India. So I agree with Ritamra, like the whole idea of moral community and the way people have looked at, same, James Scott, has critiqued it, brilliantly, the whole idea of moral community or, what it is, Because see, when Ambedkar, I'm just rushing through. When Ambedkar is writing about, the community, I think Ambedkar is more a sketching, When Gandhi is writing about, look at Jayaprakash volumes after volumes, Jayaprakash as a typical, I have written about it and critiqued. My piece on seminar was heavily critiqued by followers of Jayaprakash. Whenever Jayaprakash looked at, Bihar and community, where my deputy speaker of Rajya Sabha comes from, Harivanshi, same village, same neighborhood, they share the houses, and they present a picture of idolized, conflictless, paradise. But when Ambedkar, looks at Bihar, he has a very different idea. Karpuri Thakur has a very different notion of moral community. I think, we need to look at and we need to critique, that. So what is it? My sense is that this whole idea of moral community is imagination, is a fabrication, empirically.
I should come in here. No, I wasn't.
Yes.
In the book, I don't suggest that there is a moral community. What I'm suggesting is that people were claiming a moral, they were sort of making a moral claim. Yeah. Amra garib manush, or hum garib log hain, so you must help us. Yeah. I don't, for a minute, suggest that there exists a moral community. And the idea of an agonistic politics is actually a pushback against the idea of the assumption that there is a moral society. So you have recent anthropologists, Akio Tanabe, for instance, who has proposed the idea of a moral society. And in one of the chapters, I've actually pushed back against that notion of a moral society, saying that that's not what people have in mind when they make claims about being poor, because in making a claim about being poor, they're actually identifying the rich as the social other. So of course that comes, that breaks the notion of a moral whole, of a moral community. You've both mentioned the dynamics of caste, or as political scientists would like to call it, ethnicity, whatever you call it, but that caste...
I'm fine with caste only. Ethnicity is every lot, I'm comfortable with caste, I'm not ethnicizing.
No,
but I worry about it. I worry about, because that really radically disturbs the politics of Dalit, because the moment it becomes ethnic, it's no longer the politics of Dalit,
But in say in a place like Bihar, rural Bihar, which you talk, people talk constantly about backward forward split.
True.
And the term backward is not only a caste category. I've realized it's not only drawing on OBCs. There is an entire moral idea about a backward, people who have been kept backward, who have been pushed backward, who have been pushed down in a sense. I suppose, it would be similar to the notion of Dalit Bahujan or, whatever else. But in Bihar, you constantly have a backward forward split that is being talked about. And the notion of the backward, I think there is a moral community that is sought to be built around the notion of the backward. People who have been oppressed for generations, for centuries, and who are now sort of, coming into, prominence. Or who now should take their place under the sun, which is, of course, what both Lalu Yadav and Nitish Kumar's politics has been about, reclaiming the backward and sort of making that, foregrounding it. So I'm certainly not suggesting that there is a moral community that we shall go and find, but I find it interesting that my interlocutors tried to make moral claims.
Yes.
But of course, what is interesting also in those making of the moral claims is how agonistic they were. As in, they were built on this sort of tension, this conflict with the other. And the other was typically, either it's rich or forward, whether it's Amir or forward caste. I mean, I'm not saying that the two are, they can be collapsed. But there certainly are attempts to make those moral claims. And I find the idea, the agonistic approach to politics quite interesting, precisely to navigate these tensions. And of course, no one in the field used the term agonism, but there was the issue of a conflict, backward forward ki ladai hai yahan pe. That's unmistakable. That's unmistakable. Even in West Bengal, where there isn't where there isn't caste, but there is the idea of, people who were Gorib, who back then, were able to now, for instance, Amra lungi pore office jai. We can wear lungis to the government office. That is a very new idea of thinking about who can access government offices and who can't. And I haven't forgotten your question, Professor Hebar, about the local state, and I want to come to that as well. But this idea that people wearing lungis can now go to office, and who are these people wearing lungis? They're not the Bhadralok, certainly, but they are the so-called Chotolok, people who are in the rural hamlets, in the far-flung sort of areas that, we talked about, who may not be members of the CPM or Trinamool or whatever. They, their electoral affiliations may shift, but certainly people who wear lungis appears to be again, I don't want to use the word moral community because of the implications of that term, but there's certainly an idea that there are now people wearing lungis who can go to places where they were forbidden under Congress rule of the earlier era. And I think that gets me to thinking about the local state. I completely see the point about the local state being so porous with society. But of course, let's not forget that there is a state, and people recognize the state when they see it, whether it's the mukhya, whether it's the ward member, whether it's the BDO or, the local level sort of the NREGA, the Rojgar Sevak, as they were called, we might say that they straddle the boundaries between state and society. And of course, there is a certain porousness that is.
Indrajit, there is a question coming up here. Manish is asking quite an interesting question, that how would you reflect on categorization, category of poor, homogeneous, heterogeneous, urban poor, the rural
fantastic
poor.
Question. That's a fantastic question. As you can imagine, I've had to grapple with that a lot. So thank you for asking that question. So we are all tempted when we think about the poor to go along the income route or to go along the asset route. And, we can do all kinds of surveys to identify who's poor and, who's not poor, who's in the middle. And this, of course, maps onto what is called a residual approach to poverty. You have people who are middle class, who've been able to prosper, and those who've fallen behind. For this study, on the other hand, I took an approach that might be called a relational approach to poverty. So I looked really at two variables when I was thinking about the poor: the variable of status and the variable of labor. If people were involved in manual work, so hiring out of work or doing their own, work themselves, and they were lower down in the status hierarchy, which mostly is caste, at least in these regions, in the eastern regions, has to do with caste. Then I refer to them not in an objective kind of, ticking boxes sort of way. I recognize them as being poor. And I, in the book, you'll see I operate with a 3-class model. So there's the poor, and there's of course those who are sort of at the top of the class hierarchy. You can call them rich. In the book, I refer to them as the entrenched classes. So these are people with wealth, with income, as well as high status. And then there are the in-between groups who may have some income, some wealth, but may not have status, or who might have status, but may not have wealth and income. And that's sort of the group that I refer to as the precarious classes. And I can send a paper along with where I've explored this a little more. So you're right, the poor is not homogeneous. It's a heterogeneous group. It's heterogeneous in terms of its caste profile, obviously. I mean, there are several members of several caste groups who would be members of the poor. It's heterogeneous in terms of occupations. There isn't one occupation that the poor are involved in. They're not all agricultural workers. A lot of the people in rural Bihar and Bengal migrate. So in a sense, every one of these people that we are talking about has at least two different jobs. They may be agricultural workers in the village and construction workers in the towns where they migrate, or they might have small plots of land in the village and might be working in a brick kiln in the cities that they go to. So there's a diversity of occupation. There's a diversity in terms of their educational attainments. There's a diversity in terms of their relationships with one another. So it's a very heterogeneous group. Nevertheless, the reason I talk about the poor as if they were, they were a coherent group, is because there is this idea of who's poor, that there is Amra Gorib Manush, is not something that you're likely to hear the local landlord say. Although when it comes to claiming the BPL cards, they may well say that to the local state, but they're not likely to make a public declaration of them being poor along with others. They might tell you individually, हम तो बहुत गरीब आदमी हैं, हमको पता नहीं क्यों नहीं कार्ड दिया है. But they're not likely to make a claim which involves others to say that सब गरीबों को मिलना चाहिए. They will say कि मुझे मिलना चाहिए. Whereas when it comes to this group, whether it's Dalit agricultural laborers, Yadav or Shautal workers, they're not necessarily likely to say, I should get it and nobody else should get it. So I think there is that distinction which is vague, which is not as clear-cut as I would have liked, maybe, and as positivist social science would like. But I think there is an understanding of the poor.
I have a question, Indrajit. So in the political science literature, recently, there's been a lot of new literature on claim making and citizenship. Like if you look at the works of Gabby Wisner, Adam Auerbach. So I'm just wondering, how is your argument kind of analytically distinct from theirs? Yeah. And my second question is, could you elaborate a bit more on what kind of interaction do you see between the people and political parties and how they navigate the state? I'm sure it must have come out in ethnographies. If you could just elaborate on that.
Of course, thank you. So I think a lot of this recent work that you're referring to, makes very interesting, and I think they're pretty valid claims about how the clients have their own agency. They are able to navigate with politicians, from time to time, and I don't disagree with that, of course. I think where the two sort of bodies of work might differ is the assumption there that these are clients with, individual preferences, rational choices, so to speak. And that comes up in the methods that have been used. They run regressions, they sort of, do large scale surveys. I also did surveys, by the way, but I never went down the route of running regressions because I didn't find that to be intellectually very stimulating. Also didn't quite explain what was going on. So I think what I'm more interested in is the attempt at making groups or communities, invoking this moral community or an agonistic community, if you will. The issue of social conflict that is central to my reading of the politics of the poor even though that social context, the conflict doesn't result in revolutionary upheaval. I mean, I think we all can agree with that, but there is a social tension, there is a social conflict that is ongoing, which I'm not sure this new literature that you're referring to necessarily takes into account. I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question? Political parties.
The mediation between political parties.
Yes. I think, I mean, it was not specific to any political party. All political parties were able to have a base in these villages on the basis of how much they were seen to be able to help out people. That said, and this is again probably where a lot of this work, my work, differs from these existing works. Getting resources wasn't the only thing that drew poor people to political parties, and I found this most striking when I spoke to people who sympathized with the Rashtriya Janata Dal in Bihar. My work with the Rashtriya in Bihar started around 2009-10. So the RJD had been out of power in Bihar for about 5 years by then. They were, of course, in power in the center. So, Lalu, I think, was rail minister at that time, and Raghuvansh Prasad Singh was the rural development minister. But, that's at the center. But the way in which people would speak about the Rashtriya Janata Dal, and here I'm talking not only about Yadavs from whom you might expect, but Musahar, so-called Musahar landless laborers, who, by the way, in 2009-10 had shifted their votes to Nitish Kumar and Janata Dal and, that sort of thing. But the way they spoke about RJD and the kinds of changes that the RJD brought about in their lives, and the meaning and significance of Lalu as a politician, but also as a political, not only as the chief minister of Bihar, but also as a political leader who brought ijjat, and that's a term that I sort of could not ignore, makes me depart from a lot of the analysis which looks at political parties and people in an instrumental sort of way, as if the only thing that poor people want from political parties is resources. Of course, they do want material resources, but they would also like social and cultural resources. And the language of izzat, the language of dignity, which is something I could not ignore in Bihar. I have to say, when I started out work in Bihar, I was initially tempted to sort of draw a Bihar-Bengal comparison. And I was going to sort of find evidence to suggest that in Bengal, the poor make much greater claims and they're much more successful in making their claims because you have class politics in Bengal. In Bihar, they don't work very well because you have caste politics in Bengal, and caste breaks down class alliances. That was rubbish. I'm glad I went to Bihar and Bengal. I'm glad I thought of making this comparison because it's a nonsensical comparison as far as I could see. Biharis, the rural Biharis may not have been very successful in getting resources. Rural Bihar is not a paradigm of development, but on questions of dignity, it's something that rural Biharis have come to cherish. And I think a lot of them, irrespective of their individual political alignment, whether it's BJP or Janata Dal or CPM or whatever, they would probably credit Lalu and the RJD with that. So there's more than just resources. There's more than just schemes that poor people are looking for.
Okay, now I think we'll open the floor to the audience.
No, floor is already open.
Open, yeah. I mean, I would encourage students to ask questions, Indrajit.
Sure. I'll leave it to you to sort of moderate or tell me which questions I should answer.
I think Nitin had a question.
Nitin, yeah. I don't know. He went somewhere probably. I don't know.
Ashwini,
Nishant, you have a question? No.
I'm here.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Roy, thank you for this, kind of presentation. So I want to draw it from my own research. When we started, we come up with some kind of multi-site ethnography, and I'm like Sashmi Kumar and me, my PhD research. The reason to adopt this methodology was to understand the villages and in different places, to understand the social corruption in the public policy implementation. Now, I have a few questions to you regarding that. I mean, like when I see your field, so these questions comes in my mind because I seen Bardhan's and Mukherjee's work on clientelism and corruption, and then accountability and transparency as well. So when I see your presentation, the question come in my mind. The first was, as per your argument, who is the poor in the village society, in the class-based village society? Does this clientelism approach by the political parties address the poor? If yes, I'm like, you can take a call on that. If yes, then what manner? Is it just a popularistic manner or in a real sense? And what about in the politics of the poor? Uh, those are based on the caste, class, gender-based politics in the village. Now, the reason why I'm saying yesterday, I mean like before 2014, those people who were with the Congress, today they are with the BJP. And the only reason why they are with the BJP is because their people who are in the political power are with the BJP, and they contested through the with the help of BJP, and they won the election. So in the village, they are with them. But the real, citizen which you refers, the real poor is not with them, unfortunately. The reason, and their politics is very different. Their politics doesn't stand with this popularistic politics, the majoritarian politics, what Professor Ashwini Kumar talked about, politics of democracy. And in the majoritarian politics, this poor really, where it stands actually. Does this stands with this majoritarian, political regimes? And then we really,
True.
That's a fantastic question, Nitin.
Yeah, Indrajit, kind of, I'm coming with, what is called lungi mein nahi hota hai, charo taraf se laga hua. So what I'm trying to do, Nitin ke question ke charo taraf se na ek chota sa patta laga raha hu. What Nitin has been, researching and asking questions and again is that, poor, I'm not going back to the whole literature that he has covered and he has worked on the ground. But poor are like, new public management, political science literature, poor are client, and if they are client, then clientelism is a good answer. Although your colleagues at York and LSE and Cambridge are talking about post-clientelistic politics. If it is post-clientelistic politics, Nitin is asking the question, where are poor then? Sauradeep is banging me hard and hard with his experimental research that what poor you are talking about, poor are supporting BJP. And if poor are supporting BJP, poor are supporting majoritarian politics, Nitin is asking again and again question. I have no answer, And then if there is a politics of lynching, then where is the politics of democracy then? So I know, I mean like Nitin, he hasn't asked the question that I'm looking for. Where is politics of social audit? Social audit, we haven't designed for only instrumental sense. It is a politics of social rights. Where is Bihar in social audit? Where are poor doing, auditing? Where are poor auditing us? No, middle class and rich people are auditing. All economists are rich. All economists are upper caste. I'm not going back to sociologist and anthropologist. I don't want to annoy my friends and my relatives, my family members, because everybody is critiquing at home. That, what politics, Ashwini, you are talking about, I mean, yeah. You come from a privileged background, you're an upper caste, you're a Brahmin, you are auditing poor, you are giving property numbers. Sauradeep is hard on me this day. You haven't read this paper, you haven't read that paper. All poor are happy with economic reforms. Actually, Brahmin poor are happy. Others are happy, but Nitin, I have no answer to your queries.
The new literature says Dalits are happy.
Read Indrajit, and talk to Sauradeep also. Because he is going to be genius on experimental research.
You know, Indrajit, I've come to the conclusion that Ashwini calls me just so that he can just take on the anthropologists.
No, not anthropologists.
I can see
Samra, at home
between the two of you.
at home, my dad is anthropologist, my mother is anthropologist. Everyone has become anthropologist, and everyone is telling me that you have no answer. Yes, I have no answer.
Everybody becoming anthropologist is a dangerous thing. I don't think it's, it's a good thing.
You know, I'm speechless. You know, sometimes.
Yeah, so let's hear from
please,
Dr. Roy.
No, Ashwini, there is actually a lot that you've said which answers your earlier question about sociologists and Bihar. And, we can come back to that.
I was only reviewing Bihar, you know, I was only reviewing Bihar.
Yeah, no, but there is something there which has been going on, which I think we need to appreciate, which is the social basis, the social profile of researchers who sort of, you know, go and collect data and that sort of thing. They've just not found Bihar to be an ideal place because of Bihar's class caste churning over the last 25 years. The West Bengal communist Bhadralok is much more amenable to the, you know, to the Bhadralok academics who go and work there. That kind of synergy you're not likely to find with scholars who go to study Bihar, but we can talk about that later. I think the questions that you know, people have been asking around, the way I can break it down is really to first, the last part of Nitin, your question about the politics of the poor in relation to majoritarianism. And I think that also will probably get us to think a bit about whether the poor are necessarily in favor of majoritarianism. Are they against majoritarianism? That set of questions, and also the politics of the poor vis-a-vis this thing called neoliberalism, whatever that is, you know, which has also been indicated. And then I think I can come back to your earlier question about clientelism and, you know, this move from clientelism to post-clientelism. So there are three questions, bear with me. The first, I think, to be very clear that while there is some truth that more poor people vote for the BJP today than they did earlier, we need to recognize and this is a question that was asked, the differences within the poor. Clearly, when you caste disaggregate the poor, the support for that the Savarna poor has showed for the BJP, whether it's Brahmin or Rajput. I haven't seen the data for caste, but you know, you probably don't. But certainly Brahmin poor, Rajput poor. It's a complete sort of switch to the BJP, absolute total support. Yeah, far exceeding the support of the Brahmin rich and the Rajput rich for the BJP. So in caste specific terms, the BJP is a party of the Brahmin poor, the Rajput poor. When it comes to Dalits, and the same may be true for Adivasis, but I haven't seen the 2019 data. Tariq Tachil tells us that over the 90s and 2014, there has been a shift, but it's not clear whether it's the poor people among Adivasis or is it all Adivasis. The 2014 data, which E. Sridharan has analyzed in the EPW, suggests that it's Adivasi rich who are more likely to support the BJP than the Adivasi poor, but you do have support of the Adivasi poor. When it comes to Dalits and OBCs, as you know, they are huge caste categories. And it makes more sense, as Jafar Lord has reminded us, to think about jatis. But even if you looked at jatis, I think you would probably not find the support of the poor from the OBC and Dalit groups to be as high as it has been among the Savarna poor. So politics of the poor for BJP only among Savarnas and Rajputs. Moment you break down the caste bit, I think that might begin to answer your question about, you know, the client, you know, what is it that people are wanting? Has demonetization benefited the Savarna poor or the the Brahmin poor or Rajput poor? Has GST reforms benefited the Brahmin poor or the Rajput poor? Now, does it mean that these guys they suffer from false consciousness because they support the BJP? No, there's something else going on. And I think that goes back to the point I raised earlier, the question of izzat. And izzat, dignity, is of course a catch-all term, but we have to, I suppose, recognize that for the poor among the Savarnas, the BJP is probably a way of clinging on to ideas of social status that may have come under threat because of the Dalit Bahujan assertion of the last 25 years. In a way, it is trying to reclaim status. And here I draw a distinction between the politics of honor and the politics of dignity. The politics of dignity that I referred to earlier, the Lalu Mayavati sort of politics, is a politics of dignity for all. And we can debate this for a long time. The politics of honor, on the other hand, is a politics that is specific to specific groups or individuals. And you may find that at least in this profile, there is a politics of, reclaiming your social status, which you feel has been challenged. I haven't discussed that in the book because partly the research for the book was, done around the early part of this decade when, the BJP was was an important political player, but, didn't enjoy the kind of support among the poor. What we have seen is that the sorts of Savarna poor who may have been supportive of the left parties at the early part of the decade, they seem to have switched support to the BJP. And that might lead us to think about, what are they looking for? Is it resources? Is it that the BJP is in office, so they want resources? Probably. But I think there is much more to do with ideas about honor and reclaiming social status that has been questions.
Nishan.
I think she has done some research on this, and I don't know how up to date it is, but she certainly tries to suggest that after the announcement of the Mandal reforms, there was a sort of switch in support of the poor to the BJP. I think where she has to be more nuanced is to say that it's not the poor who switch support to the BJP, it's the Savarna poor. It's poor people from among the high castes. But Pavitra's paper is framed as the politics of the poor, which I think leads to these confusions. I think it should have been, I can't of course tell other people what they should have titled their papers, but if I were writing that paper, it would be the politics of the Savarna poor. So
Nishant is wanting to ask something. Nishant.
Yes, Nishant, please.
Yes, sir. Hello, sir. This is Nishant. Indrajit sir has talked about heterogeneity of. Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Nishant, वीडियो बंद कर दो. Nishant, वीडियो बंद कर दो. Nishant, close video.
But I think
is it still there or is
चला गया. हमरा बाड़ी में है ना, हमरा बाड़ी में है. So
नहीं आएगा वापस आएगा.
Can I just quickly
sure.
Pick up the bit about clientelism? So I have therefore.
और कोई पूछना है, पूछो.
Clientelism is a very helpful framework. I have not found it to be very helpful for exactly these reasons. It focuses too much on resources. And as I said, if you go by the strict definition of clientelism, that is political subordination in exchange of material rewards. There was rewards, there was attempts at political subordination, but I can't imagine that there is political subordination per se, and I don't understand why that would be different from democracy.
आ गया. Nishant is back. Hello, Nishant. निशांत आवाज आई? निशांत, भाई इतना देर में तो आदमी बिहार में आवाज चला जाएगा. जोर से
सेटल होने दीजिए, अभी थोड़ा पानी पिएगा फिर बोलेगा.
अरे क्या स्मार्ट है यार, क्या लग रहा है निशांत? क्या
नेटवर्क एरर सर.
अरे क्या फोटो लगाया है निशांत? Looking so good निशांत.
Thank you.
He is having the best life, visiting Bodh Gaya.
बताओ ये निशांत.
Yes, sir. Tell me.
हाँ सर को हेलो बोला पहले निशांत.
Hello sir, this is Nishant.
Sir, yes.
Sir has talked about heterogeneity of poor, that poor are heterogeneous categories. And what I come to it's not a conclusion but an inference. Both regime of Lalu and Nitish are a sort of a patrimonial regime, clientelistic regime. But Lalu never recognized that poor are heterogeneous. He always talked about poor in like they are a single agglomerate. But when Nitish come to power in Bihar, he realized the importance of heterogeneity of poor. He first established a committee under D. Bandyopadhyay to report about the level of poverty in Savarna groups. And after this plan failed, he take another move and he divided Dalits into 6 more categories of Mahadalits. So isn't it that this classification of poor played an important role in Bihar politics?
Sir, that's spot on. Yes, it did. And you're right that Lalu may have tried to create this moral community of the poor, but of course he infused it with lots of languages of caste. But I think what is the way I see Lalu's contribution, if you say, or at least Lalu's role, if we don't consider it a contribution, Lalu's role was to infuse Bihar politics with the vocabulary of dignity. And you're right, he may have started on the assumption that there's a certain homogeneity. And that was proved wrong when Nitish Kumar was able to sort of work his way around, which is why he's the most successful politician. But if you will, Lalu was the sort of, I would say, the sort of politician who pushed a certain agenda, who innovated a certain agenda, and Nitish perfected it. I think there's a lot of scholars have tried to distinguish between Lalu and Nitish, how the two are different, but I see there's a continuity between Lalu Prasad and Nitish Kumar. And you're absolutely right, sir, that there is, that Nitish's regime has been much more sensitive to the heterogeneities of the poor. But remember that it is Lalu's regime that foregrounded the issue to start with. And it is true that he talked more about caste, but remember, when he spoke about caste, he was really saying that members of entire caste groups are poor and therefore they need help. So that narrative is something that Lalu introduced, and then Nitish gave it perfectionism. For that reason, by the very definition of clientelism, as you, sir, very correctly said, Lalu's regime was a failure when it came to providing resources. And the definition of clientelism is that you provide resources and you win support. But if you couldn't have provided the resources, what explains the winning of support? So it's not clientelism, it's something else. In Nitish's case, he of course provided resources. But what is wrong if people support him? Why would you call that clientelism and not democracy? Because that is rewarding the politician who has delivered. He promised, he delivered. I mean, it's a bit like the present Indian government, and I'm not saying whether right or wrong, but they promised certain things in their election manifesto. They delivered it. We can agree with them, we can disagree with them, but one thing we can't call them is being clientelistic. That's my problem with the clientelism narrative. It's helpful to a certain extent, but I think everything, if everything is clientelism, you know, it has to have some, that meaning, that word has to have some specificity, some definition. I think
Indrajit, I think, you know, the new literature, you know, there is a revision, you know, what we call in political science, revisionistic, you know, clientelism. I mean, like these are ideal type Weberian constructs, and there are also ethnocentric constructs. You know. So political science, for instance, in the olden days of American politics, the fourth barrel was not called in political science clientelism. Fourth barrel was a regular congressional activity. Even Harold Loswell never considered fourth barrel as a clientelism. So we need to look at, you know, how the idea of clientelism is now up for revision, and new scholars are revising it, and especially James Banner has written, extensive essay about revision of clientelism. Also in Tamil politics, also clientelism has been revised. And there is a new race catching up in political science. It's called programmatic, programmatic regimes.
Yes.
I will share my paper. I just got editor's note. So once it is out in Commonwealth Journal, I will share my revision on programmatic regimes and clientelistic regimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think that these are not, analytically tight compartments,
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so the problem in political science, what happened in the last 10, 15 years, a lot of people, innocently accepted clientelism as a proxy term to explain politics of India, or especially politics of poor, And that extended to Latin America and Africa. Saradip is now debating with this, how Harvard political scientists, especially when flies to Latin America, always finds evidence of clientelism, not politics of poor.
Yeah. Susan
Urban
Stokes.
politics particularly. Urban politics particularly
I have to
in
say
Latin
the
America.
best place to look for clientelism is in academia. Yeah. Not among poor people's politics, not among rich people's politics, it's in academia. That's where any student of clientelism should go and study.
Yes. So any other questions, Saradip? There are students I can see, and there are researchers I can see. Soumya is around. Srishti wanted to ask something. Ravinder is around. Where are others? I haven't heard anything from Suklaji. There is somebody called Suklaji. Suklaji?
I don't think he's there.
Acha. Suklaji is not there. Anyone? Chai I can't offer. Chai nahi mil sakti hai.
Don't worry. Don't worry.
मैडम कुछ कह रही है. Professor Haber wants to say something.
नहीं और मैं कितना बोलूं?
इनको बोलने के लिए कहा है ना, ये कहाँ गए ये सब बोलने
क्योंकि मैं बोलने लगूंगी बाकी नहीं होगा. I mean, it's such an interesting area to discuss. Then we can just go on, and then there are these children, MA students. Let them ask.
Yeah,
it's meant for them. So
मैं उन्हीं के पीछे कर रहा हूँ. आशुतोष कहाँ? आशुतोष कुछ पूछो भाई. खाना फूड छत्तीसगढ़ का सवाल पूछो भाई. हिंदी, इंग्लिश, तमिल, मलयालम कुछ भी पूछो भाई.
हेलो.
हाँ बोलो.
गुड आफ्टरनून मैम. गुड आफ्टरनून सर. नो सर, डाउट तो अभी कुछ है नहीं.
क्या है?
हेलो.
हाँ.
हेलो.
Indrajit, your book is available now in paperback.
Abhi paperback mein, it has not yet arrived in paperback.
Okay.
But
I hope in post-COVID you sign the copy for us and we will buy the copy.
Bilkul. Yes, I'm sure there'll be other ways in which I can share copies with you, which we shouldn't talk about on an online forum like this.
अच्छा सौम्या anything on you? अच्छा सौम्या का एक सवाल आया है. मैं थोड़ी अपनी हिंदी भी सुधार रहा हूँ क्योंकि नेशनल एजुकेशन पॉलिसी में कई भाषा बोलनी है. तो माझा मराठी सुधे नहीं आहे, मतलब 3-4 भाषाएं बोलना है. She is asking that Professor Roy hasn't spoken anything about UP. What is the politics of UP, in terms of poor, because now you have a monk, Yogi ji, Yeah. I would not like to say further on that.
Yeah. See, I mean, one of the issues, of course, when one does ethnography, we should ideally, sort of reflect on the areas that we've done work. But I think ethnography also has the advantage of allowing us to reflect on broader global questions.
Yes.
And so I will use that lens rather than saying I have not actually gone and studied Uttar Pradesh, but I can use the reflections from, the Eastern India to suggest that in some ways Uttar Pradesh politics is probably similar to Bihar in terms of the anti-caste politics that emerged in the 1990s, where there was, at least there were the languages of dignity that was espoused. Again, like in Bihar, the state level politics may not have benefited the poorest as much as we would expect, But I think if you look at the data, and this is something where I would actually want to, respond to a point that was raised earlier by Shoradeep. If you look at the data, actually poverty rates in Uttar Pradesh fell under the regimes of Mayawati and Mulayam Singh Yadav. Now, economists sitting in Delhi have said, oh, this is neoliberal reforms that benefited the poor. Whether it's neoliberal reforms or Uttar Pradesh's state politicians, how are they to say? On the one hand, you say UP didn't liberalize enough. You say that Uttar Pradesh was a closed state, protectionist state, lawless state. On the other hand, you want to claim that neoliberal reforms resulted in poverty reduction in Uttar Pradesh. You can't have your cake and eat it too. So in my understanding, the politics of places like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar over the 1990s may have been responsible for the sort of poverty reduction that we saw in these states, rather than this thing called neoliberal reforms. But I'm not an economist. I don't want to venture into the economist's territory, but I have often wondered why this link has not been drawn between poverty reduction of the 90s and the emergence of anti-caste movements and very different sorts of government that we saw. Relating to the present day politics, I think there is some of the data which suggests that, the point that we were raising earlier, that it's perhaps the Savarna poor who have switched support to the BJP in large numbers. And that may have had to do with their worries about the rising anti-caste politics in Uttar Pradesh, and the worry that under Samajwadi Party and Bahujan Samaj, the upper caste would lose their privileges. And I think what you see is, what might be called a sort of, trying to reclaim your status, which of course, hurts the poor among the Savarnas more than the rich, because the rich are able to access other ways of enhancing their status, which are not available to the poor. Among the Savarnas, I'm not saying poor generally, but which are not available to the Savarna poor. I think we should be very clear about that. So not a very comprehensive response to the situation in Uttar Pradesh, but just some broad thoughts.
Other thoughts? Any other thoughts, Subham? Lalu Yadav? I think, Subham, we have debated Lalu extensively, I guess. Laluji is always, favorite of masses, So I think if anything new want to add, from your policy class, we have debated new papers, new literature on social welfare, maybe, there is a very gripping conversation, the politics of social welfare, why, if there is a politics of poor, why not there is a politics of social welfare? We have heard a lot about, caste. Anyone? I'm trying to provoke people. Vikas, Anamika, and others.
This Shubham Sinha seemed to be, I don't know who Shubham Sinha is, but
Shubham Sinha. Shubham is asking JDU improving on the caste-based politics of Lalu. I think, read Jeffrey Lott, is Mandal 1, Mandal 2, Mandal 3, and alternations between them. I guess, is here. But Subham question is that, if you can answer briefly, Indrajit.
Yes, so I think Shubham's question is about the Janata Dal United and the BJP, and the BJP growing at the expense of the JDU. I mean, Bihar in that way is still a very, very interesting model, where the BJP has actually benefited from the JDU in terms of being able to attract the votes. And you could say that Bihar is one state where the NDA, as in its coalition, has really gathered votes of the poor across caste groups. That's what the recent national election survey also shows. Now, whether this means that BJP will grow at the expense of JDU, or the BJP needs the JDU in Bihar, for the foreseeable future, is anybody's guess. Now, the BJP, I think, continues to be seen as a high caste party in Bihar, but I may be mistaken. You would know much more about the situation in Bihar, and in a sense, the BJP JDU coming together is an attempt to bring together the backwards and the forwards, rather than taking over the JDU. I don't think the BJP can swallow the JDU yet, but given the way the BJP has expanded its footprint, it may well try. We've seen, though, in other states like Maharashtra and Punjab, where the BJP has tried to swallow its alliance partners, it has usually resulted in a split. The Shiv Sena left the BJP. Now the Akalis have left the BJP. JDU has already left the BJP once, although there was a lot of drama, as you know. Who knows where that will go. So I'm not going to wager one way or the other, but I don't think that the BJP can swallow the JDU as easily as it would like.
There's also a question by Ashtesh, I think. Shaurabhi, if you want to read it out.
Oh, 1 minute. He's asking that, can it be inferred that clientelism is merely a politics of exclusion?
Yeah, I mean, again, I suppose there are two ways to respond to that. Clientelism, and the Hickens article is actually very interesting. It's a sort of very nice way of defining exactly what we mean. Clientelism may certainly be an attempt by political elites to exclude. But remember, it's also a way of political elites to include. And I think I see Ashwini's point just now about Tamil Nadu being the best example. A lot of Hickens himself and a lot of folks would say Tamil Nadu is classic clientelistic politics. But if that clientelistic politics benefits the poor, what is the problem? In fact, if it's not exclusive at all, it's inclusive. Tamil Nadu today has poverty indicators that are among the lowest in India. And if you look at multidimensional poverty indicators, which is what the United Nations now sort of pushes, Tamil Nadu is at the level of several European countries. If clientelism has brought Tamil Nadu to that, what is the problem? I think it's a great way to go. I think the problem is when to define whether what you saw in Tamil Nadu was clientelism or not. A politician telling the people that if you vote for me, I'll give you a TV. Now, who knows who the person voted for? Did they vote for the politician who promised a TV, or did they vote for the politician who promised a radio? Who knows? But the politician who promised the TV comes to power and they give TVs to everyone. Would you call that clientelism?
Actually, also the thing is that one can't see this politics of clientelism in isolation also. Tamil Nadu politics per se has been quite radical.
Exactly.
The anti-caste movement and whatever else. And this politics of clientelism comes at a different point in time. And so if you were to take politics of clientelism here and say compare it to Bihar or any UP or any other place, you'll see differences. So I suppose you can't sort of just isolate like this and also...
So the broader political context, as you say, is absolutely essential. And in Tamil Nadu, it is always interesting why Tamil Nadu's sort of, achievements are never linked to the anti-caste movements of that state. That itself is a casteist sort of move, I think, by a lot of our scholars. Like I mentioned the case earlier about so-called neoliberal reforms, impacting poverty reduction. Why would you credit neoliberal reforms and not anti-caste movements? These are, I think, questions that the next generation of scholars should ask and should challenge those of us who stick to these existing paradigms.
But Indrajit, I'm returning to a very lively debate that happened in LSE some years back about what they call degree of democracy in Indian states. And I guess John Harris moderated that, where two great works on clientelism were presented, including Narendra Subramaniam, my good dear old friend who teaches in McGill University. I think path-breaking works. So what I'm again restating that clientelism as a theory is being revisited, And if you look at the new typologies, even Atul Kohli is now skeptical about. Atul has never used the term clientelism in his 30 years of work.
Yeah, but he did call Mayawati's Uttar Pradesh as an example.
Yeah, I'm coming back. I was there.
Neo-patrimonial.
Yes.
But wait a second here. Atul was there. I was on the podium when Atul made that remark about patrimonial. And Atul regretted, this is a conversation, so I can say, someday when I'm writing in the book, certainly in footnotes, I will mention that conversation. In the evening, in the week, Atul Kohli went into a long explanation about making analytical distinction between patrimonial, a Bavarian category, and clientelism. That's a regret, He should have done a better job in his book, he told me. And especially if you come to, and there is, Atul Kohli, there is a concluding chapter. In the concluding chapter, Atul goes back to Mayavatiism as a politics of, radical reform. So patrimonialism has has an analytical power to explain wherever you find the phenomena patrimony. That is where Narendra Subramaniam, John Harris, debated that, look, how long can we use the term patrimony and patrimonial regime? Is there any regime, a typology? If you go back to political science, classic literature, Peter Evans, Theda Skocpol never used the term patrimonial in the regime categorization. I'm speaking also to a bunch of fresh, bright, grad students in top universities in the world today, including, Saradeep Saswat, No political scientist has used the term patrimonial as a regime category. We can use predatory. I think recently some of my colleagues at London use the term predatory, but that's also very, very, kind of, troubling concept, predatory, because same Jharkhand could also be, John Dres tells, it's a politics of war in Jharkhand. I went to Khuti and I can see on the ground a large radical mobilization of subalterns. We can't just call, the whole state as, predatory. So my sense, just conversing, that there are new ways of, this is where research becomes such experience, where post-clientelistic and I would say, a more benign category. I think, where Narendra says that before you use the term clientelism, you look at the political context and then use the term.
I would
don't go by a tender allocation. That if I give a tender to my party worker, it's not a good example.
Actually, in anthropology, we'll associate a strong notion of time to the idea of poverty and the way in which we even look at clientelism. So because poverty and the poverty elevation, when you associate it with in terms of structural change, there is a very eternal notion of time, which is like endless and, a postponed notion of time. But what clientelism does is actually makes it very contemporary. It's a transaction that happens here and now. And that's why elections are not won by great leaders. Elections are the ones are won by people who are, who are good at it, in clientelism. And that's why it works. And people are not bought in by this notion of this, structural change that you're promising, or radical change that you're promising, say in 50 years or 20, 25 years. And there are immediate requirements and needs, and people respond to that greatly. So notions of clientelism in that sense, I think is also very enabling. It's also something that actually recognizes the poor as citizens and people who are seeking something out of the system. So, it's a very heavy, for me, it's a very heavily loaded idea and concept.
That is where, you're looking at politics of empowerment, and what you said, let me just come in here briefly, very briefly. There are two broad, streams of political theory. One is the Hegelian, So when you look at, who is the philosopher of poverty or poor? Hegel. I mean, like, if you look at Hegel, Standel Stone, he called in German language that poor is the most dangerous state. That's a Hegelian timelessness. So in the world theater of politics, it was Hegel who recognized poor as a dangerous class. He called it dangerous class. So you can see the literature, and when we cut to, like political science discipline coming now, you will find that gradually what's happening, in this era, democracy is becoming more or more of middle class demands. And that is where clientelism took the roots, not in the old Hegelian sense.
Well,
yeah,
I mean,
that's my sense. These are two broad, streams of political theory.
Yeah. No,
empirical political scientists look at politics of poor more as a case of clientelism and more philosophically minded. Rawls has never talked about, theory of justice clientelism. When you look at Rawls, number 2, when you look at lexical category 2, where social allocation should be done in a way that it should reach to the poorest and the last. It's not clientelism.
No.
It's a Hegelian tradition,
And in some ways, I mean, I think what I've been trying to do in the book is to push forward the view that poor people's politics is not only about gaining access to resources.
Yes.
And to do that without falling into that timelessness problem that was just mentioned. I think that is key, because as you say, Professor Heber, there is the tendency to go towards the timeless quality of politics, the timeless quality of the poor. This is sort of going to happen all along, which is why 2 chapters of the book have been dedicated to analyzing the political changes that have undergone in India, in Eastern India, in the 2 states, as well as in the local villages, which is why the politics of the CPM and the RJD become so crucial, because these are not, this is not the same sort of politics that you could have ever seen in the Congress era, the one-party dominance era. You couldn't have seen this in the colonial era. You couldn't have seen this in the Mughal era. You can only see it after the Communist Party's sort of, actions in West Bengal, the RJD's actions in Bihar. Again, I'm not saying that this is necessarily, it's not taking us to call on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a question of political context and of understanding the political reverberations that have continued of those changes. Which, as we also see, despite all these politics, you also see growing inequalities across India, and that does mean that there's something very tense and tenuous going on, which has to be explained.
Okay, I guess it's time to wrap up. We've been talking for more than 2 hours.
Wow! Yes.
Amazing. It was really good.
No, thank you so much.
No, thank you, Indrajit. Thank you so much for making our time for this session, and hope we can invite you in person someday.
Yes, and I hope to. Yes, I mean, there's just so much. It's a 500-page book, so it's just very difficult to sort of put it into 20 minutes, and then of course 2 hours is it's great to sort of have a chat about it. So thank you so much, and I hope to be able to present the book in person to you at some point.
Sure. And also, Professor Heber, so Indrajit has also contributed to a migration book.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, so he's contributed a chapter, and the book will be out soon.
If I might just sort of, say a bit, just a minute, is
sure.
People that I was working with for the migration book are the same people that I worked with during the doctoral work, on which the politics of the poor is based. So one of those villages I've sort of gone back again and again since my first visit. So some of these people you will find in this book as well.
Okay. I would request the Dean to formally say thank you and end this.
No, it was wonderful, and thank you so much, Dr. Roy, for the talk and for this very engaging discussion also. And I think we're going to take back many of the points that you've made, and I think we'll invite you again once more to probably talk on the whole politics of the poor. I think that it's still brewing in my head at least, and a lot of questions I'm taking back, and I look forward to reading your book.
Yeah.
Now the first thing I'll do is try and procure a copy. And congratulations, many congratulations on the book also. I'm sure the paperback will be out soon. All the best for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. Take good care, everyone. Stay safe.
Yeah. See you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ashwini.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.